Hey guys, Lumen02. Me doing some Penny Dreadful content here today. This may be a little more boring content because I actually want to analyze this deck, which is an Esper Battle of Wits list. Now, this list is not my own, but I took the time to go through it pretty exhaustively before trying to play it, just to understand the card selection in it, understand the mana base, and understand the roles and functions of the cards and how they work together. So the central engine of the deck, as you may have guessed, is actually the WinCon Battle of Wits. But this deck very easily can win through other means. It's a value-based or value-oriented deck that utilizes a lot of board control, life gain, hand and card manipulation in the opposing side, and your own hand manipulation, and generally has Army in a Can style cards that combo very well with Recurring Nightmare, which is a great alternative win con through several combos in the deck, to include Yosai, Angel of Despair, Dinrova Hor. You have a lot of ways to control the board through Graveyard Recursion with Recurring Nightmare, and this deck will tend to fill up its graveyard relatively rapidly. So the central engine of the deck is Battle of Wits. So before we start, if you're not familiar with the card, Battle of Wits is quite simple. It's a 5-mana enchantment that basically says if you have over 200 cards in your library at the end or at the beginning of your next upkeep, you win the game. So basically it's suspend one, win the game, while you're playing a deck that consists of 248 cards. This deck does run 103 lands, which is a pretty good, solid mix of lands. One of the issues you'll run into with this style of deck is that a lot of the lands come into play tapped because it is Penny Dreadful. There's not a lot of good mana fixing, especially for a 3-color deck. The way I've laid this out is this initial pile right here, and you'll find that a lot of these cards have dual purpose. I have the hand Disruption, but like I said, a lot of cards will have dual purpose. So Entomber Exarch is also a recursion style card or utility card that could go in the Recurring Nightmare pile right here. But basically you have 6 ways of interacting with your opponent's hand, and if you do find a Recurring Nightmare and have numerous creatures, obviously you can do this much more with Entomber Exarch. Additionally, you have Auramancer, which is kind of a specific creature in case you do want to win through the Battle of Wits combo, or you need to get back a Recurring Nightmare. Typically, if you're finding this singleton is a one-off, you have lost the ability to win via Battle of Wits because you have drawn too many cards and gone below 48, which means you're playing a very long control matchup, which is good. That means a good game is being played. Typically speaking, Auramancer does not come into play when you're using Battle of Wits. Typically, you're going to use Auramancer to bring back a Recurring Nightmare so you can go into a recursion plan and try to outvalue your opponent. Next up, you have Withered Wretch, which is a singleton in the main deck. Trying to remember if I have sideboard ones or not. You have one more sideboard. There are a lot of graveyard-based strategies, and this card can be very powerful against them. Scarab Feast, same thing. This card just cycles, and it's also exceedingly good against the Living Death decks and or the Recurring Nightmare decks that are in the format. You have Recurring Nightmare, surprisingly a Penny Dreadful legal card. This card is a great engine card and a good alternate win con for this deck if you cannot win through the primary means of Battle of Wits. Next up, we have the deck manipulation / tutors, Razaketh's Right. This thing is not an all-star by any means because it's a 5-mana demonic tutor, but it does cycle for 1 mana, and it can also get you any card in the deck, which is highly relevant in a deck that's trying to win with a very narrow win condition of Battle of Wits. Diabolic Tutor, again, not an all-star in the world of tutors, but for 4 mana you can find any card in a 248-card deck. Next up you have Skittering Surveyors and Pilgrim's Eyes, fairly similar cards that both allow you to put bodies on the board that work very well with Recurring Nightmare, and also find any land to help fix your mana base. And then lastly you have Demonic Consultation, probably one of the more busted cards in the format. I would not say the most busted card in the format. I think the cheddar for that goes to Cloudpost. But Demonic Consultation, generally speaking, in a 248-card deck is going to find you what you need. However, it's a little dangerous to use this for Battle of Wits because if Battle of Wits is not in the top, let's say 30 cards of your deck when you're using this card, you're going to go ahead and put yourself below a point where you can actually use Battle of Wits to actually win the game. So typically speaking, if you're using this card, you're looking for one-off answers to board states that allow you to win the game. And if you mill beyond the ability to use Battle of Wits as a win con, then so be it. You'll have to go into a recursion win with Recurring Nightmare and your creatures. Next up, we have Card Draw. Treasure Cruise, just a very, very powerful card drawing card. Fact or Fiction, probably in my opinion the second most broken card in the format as it stands right now. Right beneath Post. But Fact or Fiction is just silly, especially in decks that want to be using Recurring Nightmare to get a lot of value. It also has Foresee, which is one you don't see that often. But when you're playing 248 cards, you need as much manipulation as you can get, or you want to fill the slot requirements for manipulation. And Foresee is actually a very powerful card, despite being slightly overcosted. You have Anticipate next, which is quite common in blue for library manipulation. Omen Speaker, which is a great Recurring Nightmare target, as well as just a good early blocker to kind of soak up some damage, which this deck often has to do because it's kind of a slow controlling deck. Azorius Charm can fulfill multiple roles. You'll see in this column right here I have board control. Azorius Charm can do board control. I put it over in the draw pile because the board control ended up being about 50 cards. But this can card draw, it can gain you random life. I've never used that ability with this deck, and it can put an attacking or blocking creature on top of its owner's library, which is a very, very powerful effect. Basically, Memory Lapse and or I can't think of it. Unexpectedly Absent, which is very powerful. The next pile we have here are kind of our value creatures, and a lot of these cards are quite powerful in this deck. Ancestress Chosen is not a well-costed 4/4, but if you can Recurring Nightmare this guy, you can generally just gain so much life that the opponent, if they're on an aggressive deck, just can't possibly win. This card is a beating against like the red decks of the format, especially in a deck that has this many cards, and oftentimes you're going to be just exchanging cards very rapidly through card draw. And just through use, you'll have a decent-sized graveyard. If this thing gains you 10 to 12 life, that's generally enough just to shore up the game against an aggro deck. Cloud Blazer, for some reason the art's not working on MTGO right now, but if you could see the art, you'd see a weird winged human scout that's flying around with some angelic wings. This thing is a little body, but I mean, a 2/2 that draws you 2 cards and gains you 2 life, trades off and blocks, or dies and blocks, and then gets Recurring Nightmared back is just very, very powerful. It's a very card-hungry deck. Vesuvian Shapeshifter, this is just a good combo card. If you have the Recurring Nightmare going, this can obviously be quite powerful. If you have like some ETB creatures that you want to continue to clone, you can continue to clone them with the morph value because you get to continue to flip this guy back and forth each upkeep, which is quite powerful if you have something like Angel of Despair, or Yosai, or Dinrova Horrors, etc. So the card's just very powerful that way. Haunted Dead is a recursive card on its own. Discarding cards can sometimes be decent in this deck because you have a lot of creatures that you're not per se like keen on casting, but you don't mind ditching them in the graveyard so you can get Recurring Nightmare value off of them, and Haunted Dead kind of helps support that. It also is kind of an army in a can card that allows you to put several chump blockers onto the board to shore up an aggressive matchup so you can bide time to get into either more board control options or a win via Battle of Wits or Recurring Nightmare. Eldrazi Skyspawner makes mana, puts 2 blockers on the board, just great. Filigree Familiar gains you some random incremental life, trades off and blocks, draws you additional cards, is a great Recurring Nightmare target, and is colorless, which is great. Lone Missionary just gains you a whole boatload of life. Typically, you'll see this card in the blue-white Blink decks that utilize Parallax Wave to control the board as well as recurse their own creatures that have a lot of favorable ETBs like Lone Missionary. This card just trades up well and buys you a lot of time. Carrier Thrall, same thing. Generally trades off and blocks, then makes another 1/1 that can either provide you with additional mana ramp or trade off again. The next pile here, which is 49 cards, is your board control option. Because this is a fairly narrow combo control deck, it needs a lot of good board control options. Angel of Despair, a very strong one. It's not impossible. This deck also likely or possibly wants a Magister of Worth just to board wipe with Recurring Nightmare, which would be also quite powerful. But Angel of Despair is quite a good one. I actually think this deck can hardcast it every once in a while. Yosai of the Morning Star. If you continue to recurse this with Recurring Nightmare, it basically means your opponent never takes a turn again, or they only take a turn with like basically 1 mana that they can play from their hand. Dinrova Horror, same thing. Once you get this thing recurring with Recurring Nightmare, the game just kind of ends if you can do it 2 to 3 times in a turn because they're just going to be discarding all their lands and they're not going to have mana base left. Planar Outburst, one of the few Wraths. All the Wraths in this format cost 4 or more mana to cast. This is a fine card. It destroys all non-land creatures, and if you have just a boatload of mana, you can make a 4/4 out of it. End Hostilities, same sort of deal. There's not a lot of permanents that attach to creatures. There may be an Enchantress-style deck in this format, but I have yet to see it. Orbs of Warding, just a fine answer to the targeted decks. It stops discard, like Lay Bare the Heart. at one point him was legal, stops that. Also stops like any point damage spells like Searing Spear, etc. Next, we have Magus of the Disc, another good board control option with Recurring Nightmare. You can continually blow up all the permanents and then return this dude back to do so again. So he's quite powerful. And next up, you have Parallax Wave, which is just a good control hedge. As well, it buys you value against other Wrath decks. For Control Magic, Control Magic is just card advantage. You take their creature, you chump block with it, or you block with it, they kill their own creature, probably kill another creature, and your Control Magic is just acquired you a 2-for-1, or they don't attack at all, and you just sit there and do nothing, which is what this deck kind of wants to do. Next up, you have Sever the Bloodline, just a good board control. It's a 2-for-1, very mana intensive, but very powerful card as well. Other end, just a great board control answer that an Esper deck can definitely exploit to answer anything with the exception of lands. Fairgrounds Warden, just a good recursive dude. Obviously, it's no Banisher Priest where you can just continually do it and exile their dude, but exile all of their dudes, but still very, very powerful against the right targets that you need to get rid of. Skinrender, just a good board control card. Necrotol, same thing. These things just generally tend to kill something and then get Recurring Nightmare into something better, which is just good value. To Invoke the Divines, always good to have answers to artifacts and enchantments in this format. And this card gains you some random incremental life to stay alive longer. Stasis Snare, just a good O-Ring-like effect. Not quite as good as O-Ring, but pretty strong. Flushbag Marauder, again, pretty much like more Necrotols. It generally tends to kill itself, though, or eat itself whenever you Recurring Nightmare it. Mana War, just a good bounce creature. Might as well, for the purposes of this deck, be a kill spell, because if they're recasting it, you tend to be fine with that. Last Breath, just very cheap removal, and you don't really care how much life they have, because eventually you'll just outvalue your opponent. Moment of Craving, this card's fine against the more aggressive decks of the format, and it gains you random incremental life to try to buy you some more draw steps and turns. Next up, you have Permission, which includes Spell Burst, 4 Syncopate, 4 Dissolve, 4 Dissipate, and that is all of the permissions. So only 13 permission spells in this list. And in the last pile here, you actually have the win con of the deck, the primary win con, which is Battle of Wits, that complements the recursion engine that you can possibly get going with Recurring Nightmare through all of the tutors. In the sideboard, you have some additional Divine Offerings, another Fairgrounds Warden for the creature-based matchups, 2 more Invoke the Divines, 2 more Parallax Waves, really for the control mirrors, I think, more than anything. Invasive Surgery against the decks that rely on Approach of the Second Sun to win. Another Withered Wretch to help support against the graveyard-based strategies. A bunch of Cranial Extractions, same story, combo decks and or graveyard-based strategies, and then one last Orbs of Warding. So this is the deck. It is a 248-card monstrosity. I think it's a little bit easier to digest once you see the deck broken down into its primary functions and purposes. As you can see, board control is a very important aspect of this deck. It constitutes 1/5 of the entire deck. It's about half the size of the mana base. So really what you're looking to do is just buy a whole ton of time and then eventually dirtle your way into a Battle of Wits win. I'm going to go for a quick pause, guys, then I'll kind of show you how this deck plays out. I do think it's one of the cooler decks that I've played in Penny Dreadful. I have yet to play this in a league, and I don't think I will. One of the issues I find with the deck and the format as it stands right now is that I think the format is largely defined by Cloud Post and Glimmer Post. I think 8 Post is kind of the universal standard if you want to have the best deck or the most competitive deck in the format, and I think decks like this control deck tend to struggle because they just can't keep pace with the mana production of that style of control deck. So in a lot of ways, if you want to compare it to like Pauper, let's say, it'd be like the Dimir Pauper deck versus the Tron Pauper deck control deck. The Tron deck's just going to win because the raw mana advantage is going to be so huge. That all said, I think decks like this will tend to shine a little bit better against the aggressive decks of the format as opposed to the post decks. Against the aggro decks, aka the Dimir versus Delver matchup results, which tend to favor Dimir, but Delver tends to beat the Tron-style matchup in Pauper. So I do think that the most powerful card, which is, I believe, Cloud Post in this format right now, kind of helps define the format itself, where I think mid-range tends to be a little disfavored. There are certainly some cool like combo mid-range decks in the format, but I don't think they're the best. I think generally speaking, you have the best decks, which I think are post-based decks that have vast mana advantage through use of their 8-post. And then the aggressive decks, which are kind of defined by post because they are one of the few strategies that are not only universally a good strategy, but are also quite good against post-style decks and allow you to win in a timetable and a time frame that the post deck can't really compete with. Before it gets its mana production underway. So that all said, I think control decks like this, control decks like Jeskai, Approach, tend to play second fiddle to the post decks, which I think relegates them probably to tier 2 status as the format currently stands under the ban listing. But enough of my rant. I'm going to go ahead and pause it, guys, and we'll jump into some gameplay of this Esper Battle of Wits deck so you can kind of check out how the deck plays out. Alright, game 1 against Kest Like a Boss. This is a keepable hand. The art's not showing up on MTGO for some reason, but we have a cyclable card, a counterspell, a Cloud Blazer to draw into more cards, and perfect mana. So I'm not upset with this hand. I go ahead and play out my Flooded Strand. I find a Swamp here. I know this is going to limit my ability unless I draw pretty well to cast Dissolve on turn 3, but I think I'm okay with that. They cast a Laybear. I just go ahead and draw. I find the island I wanted. They actually get rid of the Lone Missionary, which I think is probably wrong. I think it was either Dissolve or Cloud Blazer. I think you take away my ability to counter your spells, or you take away my ability to draw more cards. They play on a Daring Saboteur here. I just go ahead and counter it so I can get a little deeper in my deck with the Scry. I find an Utter End, which I top instantly because I would definitely like to cast Utter End. Play out the Sandstep Citadel, despite them not knowing about that card, because I kind of want to have most options available next turn. They play out a Crown of the Empires, which is an interesting card. I believe it's an M12 card, and they also play on a Ring of Evos Isle, which I believe is an M13 card. I play on a Cloud Blazer here, draw into some more nonsense. Next turn I'm going to be able to actually cast this Angel, which is pretty amazing. They tap down my guy. I could blow up the Crown, but I have 2 Utter Ends at this point. So I just go ahead and resolve the Angel and blow up their Salt Marsh to limit them on mana, which they have not been hitting very readily. And they go ahead and pack it in here. So this is kind of just an example. I mean, I don't think my opponent's deck appears to be probably a tiered deck in the format. But this is an example of how this deck, can actually cast most of the spells in it, despite wanting to utilize Recurring Nightmare or another combo finish to actually win the game. And it kind of showed some of the control aspects of the deck. I mean, you got to see some permission, you got to see some card draw, and you got to see board control through Angel, and then I have 2 additional Utter Ends, which are probably just going to abuse my opponent quite handily. If they play a threat out, I'll probably just blow it up, or I'll blow up the Ring of Evos Isle, which could also be problematic. But yeah, pretty strong showing from the Esper deck, and unfortunately for our opponent, they mulliganed pretty heavily, and their deck did not appear to be that aggressive, where we were really struggling to develop. Quick pause, guys. We'll go on to game 2, which is a little bit better of a game. Alright guys, back. This hand is acceptable. I mean, this is not a fast deck, so having a hand like this that has a good board control option, as well as a good card draw, is just fine. I play out the Tranquil Cove to gain 1 incremental life. They play out a Daring Saboteur, which is kind of irksome. I play out another tap land here. They have a Ring of Evos Isle, which they equip to this thing immediately. That means they will not be able to actually give it hexproof on my turn, so I just go ahead and Stasis Snare it, because I really don't want them looting through their library to find relevant cards. And or they could have graveyard synergies that I don't know about yet. Plan is to either go for a 4C or a Factor Fiction on the next turn. I just play out the island and intend on Factor Fictioning. If they do have like a Syncopate or something along those lines, I would prefer them to do that on their end step as opposed to on my turn. That way it limits what they play on their turn, and then I can 4C on the following turn if they don't get it. So I luck into a Battle of Wits, have another untapped Plains here. I just go ahead and slam it. I figure if they had Counter Magic, they probably would have used it on the Factor Fiction. And in worst case, if this gets countered, I have plenty else going on in my hand. Managed to wrap it up here. They don't have a way to interact with the Battle of Wits, and on my next upkeep, I'm going to win with a 231 card library. So not the most interesting of games. I've probably played 6 to 8 games with this deck. They've all been of varying quality. One of the things the deck can struggle with is like very, very linear, like red deck wins linear aggro decks. But oftentimes, against like the mid-range decks, it tends to be okay. And I also think it tends to struggle with the more uniform control decks, the more streamlined post-control decks. I just don't think it's quick enough to really stay in the game against those decks. And if they know what you're up to, which is generally pretty obvious what strategy you're on if you're playing a 248 card deck, then they tend to be able to just counter the right things. They can allow your 5-mana tutors to resolve and then just counter your Battle of Wits, which, typally speaking, I mean, unless you want to wait forever, you're probably going to be forced to slam. But still, a very interesting and fun deck. I think it's I very much so like the creative design by the builder of this deck, which was not me. And I hope that going through it and kind of showing you, their creative design and their theory of build, it kind of helps inform you on how the deck operates, what it can do, and also, how it functions. Because I think oftentimes folks will just net deck a deck, which I did with this deck, and not really break it down and understand the theory of play behind the deck, and also what the deck is designed to do, and how consistently it can do that. So when you look at this build right here, this deck is primarily designed in a lot of ways like the Jeskai approach deck. It's typically speaking more of a board control deck than it is a permission-based deck, although it can do both. Board permission is its modus operandi and how it bides time to eventually get into its combo win con of Battle of Wits or Recurring Nightmare. So anyways, guys, I'm going to cut it here with these two very short games. Sorry for the truncated gameplay, but I really just wanted to break down the deck itself and, kind of show one of my appreciation for its build and design, and also kind of, hopefully, if you're newer to the format, or maybe if you haven't seen this deck or are interested in picking it up, hopefully help enlighten you on how I see the deck best functioning. Okay, guys, I'm going to go ahead and cut it there. Enjoy the PD content, and I'll be back later for more PD content, hopefully. All right, take care now, guys, and thanks for watching.